Welcome back to another episode of Young Voices of the North. I'm your host Arlo, and I'm joined by my co-host Eniola.
Hi there.
And our very special guest, Maureen Brown.
Hi.
And today, since it is Indigenous History Month, we're going to be discussing residential schools, specifically being a secondary residential school survivor. So, Maureen, what is a secondary residential school survivor?
First of all, I'm very proud of you young ladies.
Thank you.
I'm so impressed, and it's so important to have your voices out there. Hey?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Okay, so a secondary residential school survivor is a child of a residential school survivor and someone who is raised by a survivor and the effects of what that is.
Okay, and how did having a parent that attended residential school affect the way you grew up and your family life at home?
Okay. It's actually affected it affects the family life, of course, because there wasn't any parenting skills that the survivors learned in the residential school. There was a lot of isolation, and so the affection, the emotional well-being of a child wasn't developed, and so therefore those impacts onto the family and ultimately to the individual is can be identified throughout my life. And I'll give you an specific example. My father wasn't able to provide me with the emotional support that I needed, only because he wasn't equipped to. He didn't learn those skills in the residential school, so there was no hug, like really heartfelt hugs. And whenever I went to hug him, he would just be, he wouldn't know how to respond to that. And so that impacted me greatly, because it's very important for human beings to have that touch, for nurturing, for an individual to grow, right? And so that affected me greatly. And so then when I was growing up, what happened was I sought that loss. Okay, first of all, let's backtrack. Okay, I wish I actually had my diagram of, have you ever seen the medicine wheel?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay. So in there, the Indigenous worldview is a holistic worldview, right? So the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual part of who we are as individuals is whole. And so that's how we view the world. And so when any of those areas is lacking, what happens is that whole is always whole. So let's say I was lacking that emotional and that physical in touch, those parts of me, and the spiritual, then the whole remains whole, and whatever is lacking is taken up by the other quadrants. Yeah, the other areas of your life. And so for me, let's say the physical and emotional, because that was lacking, then I filled that up with, things that were not healthy, destructive behaviors, destructive patterns, namely, let's say when I was younger, drugs, alcohol, what else? Unhealthy relationships, right? And so it impacts you greatly because you're starting off your life as a young teenager, a young adult, and those areas in your life are lacking, and you try to fill them with things that are not healthy. And so when you begin your journey as a young woman, you know, and you have those lacks in your life, though, you soon develop destructive behaviors that are not healthy. And that's all can be, you know, you can go back to just not having that emotional support or emotional, I don't know what word I'm looking for. Yeah, just that emotional support that my father wasn't able to give. Although he did express his love in different ways, such as I still have birthday cards from him that he gave all his children. They raised 12 kids. And early in my life, he drank a lot. He is also a veteran of World War II. He landed on Juno Beach, June 6, 1944, and he went from residential school to the war. So he faced a lot of trauma in his life, and his coping was drinking. And that drinking resulted in our family having to face uncertainty, because he'd be gone, you know, many days out of when he was going out, he wouldn't come back for a long time. And also violence. But he quit drinking when I was 9, so my younger siblings don't have any recollection of how our home life was prior to that.
Okay, so would you say that it affected how you interact with others on a daily basis, or?
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah.
Because when you don't have that, you know, that kind of nurturing growing up, then you become self-conscious, and you become aware of how, you know, what you're lacking when you see other children just, you know, living normal, well, what is normal these days, so living fulfilling lives, and you recognize that, and it affects you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you repeat that question?
Yep. Did you notice an effect on other relationships, like your friends or others that you interact with daily?
Oh, absolutely. Because some friends, you know, they had both parents at home, and maybe they didn't drink, and so you quickly realize, okay, this is not normal. Yeah.
Would you say that your family relations now are still affected, and in what ways?
I would say that the effects of the residential school era will take generations to fix. The families raised by residential school survivors were raised by survivors who did not have the upbringing of family. They were actually placed in a situation where they were ostracized from the family, and that was a plan by the Canadian government. I don't know exactly what date this happened, but this is what happened in beginning this whole process in our country. There was a government agent who was sent onto a reserve to observe the First Nation people. And so what he discovered when he went to a reservation, this happened in BC, was he recognized the importance of family in the First Nation community, and that the child was not only protected, if you can imagine a circle, by the parents, but by the siblings, the grandparents, the aunties, the uncles, and the community. And so they quickly realized that in order to effectively assimilate our people, they would have to remove the child from that. And that was the only way that they would assimilate our First Nation people. So that was the plan, to remove the child, and that's exactly what happened. And when that happened in our country, the old people share stories about communities, right? Probably in every community, the women and probably the men, like the families, wailing on the loss of their children. And during that time also, there was a lot of parents that turned to drinking. And that's when there was this really big influence of alcohol in our communities because of the absolute traumatic loss of having your child taken and not really knowing or understanding where they were, and recognizing as First Nation people, our children are, a gift from the Creator, and that they, our responsibility as parents as to nurture them and to guide them, and to have that removed was absolutely devastating to our communities and our families. And that disruption the effects of that disruption can be felt and seen to this day with people that are homeless and people that are on the streets, or people that have given up their fight through, taking their own life. That's how much it has impacted our communities.
So it's like you're born with a heartbreak, right?
Oh, absolutely. And because, I don't know if you're familiar with cellular memory. Yeah, okay. So you recognize that blood memory is inside of us, right? And a lot of people are not aware of it. It's not something that people are conscious of. And when I worked as a residential school coordinator for my community, it was very interesting because I would receive police reports because of my, the position I held as far as promoting healing in our community. And I would see these police reports, and they were like pretty, steady throughout the first part of the year. But then come August, it was like insane. The violence and all of the different charges of mischief and all of these things would just skyrocket in August and September. And even though the young people or the ones that were creating this violence or this mischief in the community, they had no idea that they were being affected by the trauma of our people. They were secondary survivors or descendants of residential school survivors. And so that agitation and that deep traumatic loss and grief that their parents, their grandparents went through during that period was passed on to that generation, and they had no idea. And there's no way that a lot of people don't make the connection, but that's what's happened. And so I found that very, just very, well, insightful in the sense that, okay, we have all this work to do to get, our people to begin to understand the extent of the trauma that we've experienced in our communities.
So growing up, were you ever connected with your culture at all? Did you ever dance or sing?
Absolutely. When I was initially, absolutely not, because you have to remember that I was born in the 60s. I was born smack right into the middle of assimilation policies, indoctrination of the First Nation people, and indoctrinated with the ideology of white supremacy, that our people had nothing to contribute. We were dumb, we were stupid, we were drunks, we were all these things that I'm now realizing is nothing but one big lie. But that's what indoctrination does. And so you're indoctrinated by in the school system through texts, through teachers, instructors, and just indoctrinating you with the idea that your people had nothing to offer, or that we were nothing. So that's the first part of my journey, right? And then around, I think I was like 13, there was like this resurgence. And that's when American Indian movement came in during that time. And then some of our older teenagers had hooked up with the people down south with the American Indian movement, and they brought that spirit of resurgence into our community. And so then there was this big push for, his name was Joey Ross. There's actually a school named after him on the res. And he brought some people together, and we started dancing at the Friendship Center just right here. And there was this group of our friends that wanted to dance, and so we started dancing. And that's when during that time there was this really deep longing in my heart to know who I was as a Native person, and block out all of the narratives that I was being taught in school and in society. And so I started dancing, and as did a few of us. And then Joey Ross would take us to different communities where they promoted our culture too. It was a really sweet time. Yeah. And then right after that, shortly after that, then I just wanted to hang out with my friends. But then there was a group that just kept going. So that's really good. Yeah.
Do you believe becoming more in tune with your culture allowed you to learn more about yourself and become more at peace with yourself?
Oh, absolutely. Most definitely. Because every individual that is born into this world is born free and independent. And as you know, the minute that we start our life here on this earth, we learn about who we are, and because we all have different cultures, different teachings, but knowing who you are gives you the ability and the determination and the, what is the word? It's kind of like steadfastness, or just that you're so grounded in who you are and you are at peace with who you are. And I find that with my generation, because I'm 63, that came at a later time for us. Because, and this, I hope there's, younger, well, there are younger people listening to this. Okay, I want you to understand that my generation, and even maybe in their 50s, we grew up during a very hostile time in our history. And I don't think the young people recognize or realize the gravity of what we just walked through. And so then, we have this generation, which is my generation and older, and maybe 10 years, whatever, younger. I grew up during a time in my community when our people were being thrown off the bridge for being Native. I grew up during a time when the elders can walk into town and be they would be spat on their face. I grew up during a time when we would walk on the sidewalk and we weren't, how dare we walk on the sidewalk when there's white people coming and you just move aside. Those are unwritten rules. And for the guys, they'd have to fight. And they knew every time they came to town, they would have to fight. Like, I can't even imagine. Or the terror I've experienced, the terror of being chased by a car full of white men. Or standing in an empty store waiting to be served. And I wouldn't be served until a white person comes in, they're served, and then I would be served. So those messages are, are messages you grow up, and pretty soon you begin to feel, self-conscious. And you begin to believe these narratives that you've been fed all your life. And it's like, frickin' takes a lifetime to get over that, And I use frickin' a lot, so I hope you don't mind.
Thank you so much for sharing all that. It really opened my eyes personally, I know, about the history of this town. My family were actually immigrants, so it really does open my eyes about how this town was before. So now, this being National Indigenous History Month, we wanted to ask you some questions about that. Yeah. So the first question is, do you think National Indigenous History Month is getting enough publicity, especially considering it is also Pride Month in June?
I actually find it very intriguing that both are on the same month. I'll tell you why. Because in our language, there is no gender. There's no he, she. And that's because, the balance of matriarchs and patriarchs. Some people, a lot of people get hung up on identifying themselves. Okay, I'm going to share an illustration. And this is however you use this is fine. Okay, so you see this glass. This is a measurement, right? And this can be applied to anything, whether it's knowledge, whether it's, perception or any of that. Okay, so this measurement is always only ever going to get what it can contain, right? So in First Nation culture, First Nation teachings, this could be like the essence of an individual, okay? The spirit of an individual, the energy of an individual. And so when I think about, this month being National Indigenous History Month, and the other being
Pride Month.
I think it does people a disservice when we start trying to contain people. All right. I'm on council at OCN. And so we've had individuals come and say, can we fly the pride flag in June? Absolutely. But on my next statement is, we'll at some point in the future get to a place where we don't need the pride flag flying in our community. We would have gone back to our teachings, and that is, people are people. I grew up with gay friends, and in our culture, like, I observed my parents, my grandparents, my aunties, my uncles, and people were just people. They didn't classify them. They didn't say, oh, that's so-and-so, he's gay, like that. He was like, oh, that's so-and-so. It was like irrelevant. They were human beings. Yeah.
As a two-spirit person, I really appreciate that, kind of definition. Like, I haven't been able to fully encapsulate everything you just said, so thank you.
Yes. That. So it's always about balance. And, there's, when people think of genders, it's like those are energies, Yeah. So.
Yeah. My next question is, how can people become more aware of Indigenous history?
I think, for me, people can become more aware of Indigenous history just by being present. Mm. Because when you're not present, you miss a lot. And there is a lot of opportunity for people to learn about Indigenous history. But they'd rather be somewhere else. You know what I mean? And so just be present. When you're out, maybe shopping, and maybe you see a phrase, you read a phrase, or you see people and they're different and you know that they're Indigenous, then, that train your mind to take that as a trigger to be thinking about Indigenous issues. This is our home. You're all on our homeland. Our people had this phrase when I was growing up, and that phrase is "Kinano uma kitaskino." This is our home. Yeah.
How does National Indigenous History Month improve society?
I believe that when we have a greater understanding of people's culture, then we were more open, and we're able to provide more, be more kind, be more compassionate, be more understanding. And I believe that the ideology of patriarchy and dominance has really affected the whole world. And when we don't appreciate other cultures, we're upholding that ideology. And that ideology says, I'm better than you are. And because in First Nation culture, we have, the medicine wheel is a circle, and we all come into that circle, and we're all equal. It's not like, the hierarchy that society promotes out there, which is really stressful and which really takes away the individuality of every person born into this world. Yeah.
Do you feel marginalized in Canada?
Oh, absolutely. There is marginalization on every front, especially, being a First Nation person, totally marginalized. We are the most audited group in all of the country. We are the most incarcerated group in all of the country. We have the highest suicide rate. We have the highest incarceration rate. We have the highest, probably the highest rate of any disease, diabetes, heart disease, and all of those can be attributed to the constant assault on our nation. Those things just don't happen. Those are actually preconceived results of a war that's started over here. To take our country, to take the resource, extract all of the resources from the lands. And we are the land. And we are the water. And that's why, our people are being affected, because the water's being affected. The land is being affected. And it's a natural consequence of those things. And people don't recognize that because they're disconnected. But we know that we are connected.
So earlier you mentioned being chased by a car.
Full of white guys.
Yeah. And just all that racism you had to experience, when you go to the store and stuff.
Yeah.
So do you feel that the older generation still harbor racist mentalities?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They're there. And that's why I firmly believe that there needs to be a conciliation with society and with First Nation people. There needs to be a healing that takes place in a massive way, because those attacks, those assaults, which continue to this day toward our people, that needs to be healed. That's a huge, huge thing that has to happen if our communities in our country are going to prosper in a good way. Because there are laws. There are laws that, I cringe when I see things happening in the world, when people treat each other the way that, so are people being marginalized and treated as second-class citizens in our own country. And there's like consequences to that. And I don't think the people that are running the country recognize that's like, you don't do those sort of things without without serious consequences, you know? Because when we came from the spirit world to this world, we came with instructions, and those are called creator laws, right? And on how to live as a human being and how to treat your fellow human being, fellow human man, and creation, all of creation. They're in the laws, and for our people to sit back and see people violating these laws, it's like, I don't think they really recognize what they're doing, you know, like that.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I think that we both, as well as everyone else listening to this, have learned a lot from you. So we thank you so much for coming here to be with us.
Yes, very powerful message, and we thank you for joining us today. And thank you to all of our listeners and my co-host Eniola and our very special guest, Maureen. Do you have any last words for our listeners?
I actually do. I don't know. I think we all long for a world that would live in harmony. And the only way to restore that harmony is to recognize that every single human being born into this world is born free and independent. And in that independence is an individual who needs to express their individuality. And when we begin to impose our beliefs, our domination on that person, then we are taking away their autonomy, we are taking away their freedom. And we don't want to do that. We want to promote independence and freedom for all people. Because when you stop and think about it, who is anyone to take that from you, right? In our teachings, there's a teaching, and I'll close off with this. It's called the law of non-interference. You're not going to find it anywhere. It's not written down. It's something that I discovered after years of assessing my upbringing and being able to formulate what was going on and coming up with this law of non-interference. So growing up, probably your age, my mother would, guide me and instruct me. But after every instruction, she always said, "Kinamanes, kinanes," which translate to, it's up to you. It's your life. My job is to teach you. And so then when we force people to become something they're not, we're not respecting that individuality. Okay? And so my mother, that's one of our teachings, right? So you're not going to, as far as spirituality, you're not going to hear people on the res saying, "What are your beliefs?" They're not going to ask you that. And I found it interesting because I asked my brother, who is a former chief of Pasquia, and I phoned him when I realized that. I thought, oh my goodness, our people never asked me this. What are your beliefs? what are your whatever, right? And so I called and I said, I just realized something. Our people don't ask, what are your beliefs? And he's a pipe carrier. And he said, that's rude. That's disrespectful. Because you're going into that person's, individuality, even though we are a collective at OCN. That's how we see the world, as a collective. We're all related, we're all connected. And but we also recognize that you're an individual and that you came here from the other side with specific gifts, right? And so I'm telling you this as an older person. Now I'm in my 6th decade, having to take off all of the indoctrination that and decolonizing my mind, deconstructing my theology, only to come to the realization that we're all born free and independent.